Apparently, Chris Eubank Jr. could face unbeaten Kazakh Janibek. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his surname in his next fight in some type of WBO title bout. It depends on what happens with Demetrius Andrade because, of course, he was looking to move up to 168, and therefore that would leave his WBO belt at middleweight vacant. But he hasn't apparently made the decision on that yet. Now, according to Ben Shalom, who isn't Eubank Jr.'s promoter, but of course he is the lead promoter on Sky Sports, he said it's now time for Eubank Jr. to fight for world titles, and those fights against the likes of Kell Brook and even Billy Joe Saunders can wait for now. It's now time for him to push on to world honors. So, like I say, this Janibek individual is the interim champion at the moment. We look at his look at his box rec. This is Janibek. That's his surname there, if you want to attempt to pronounce it. I know there's some people who are going to be watching that are from an Eastern European background or are very familiar with Eastern European languages, and they're going to say, come on, Hatman, it's not that hard to pronounce. No, it is that hard to pronounce. Okay, for most of us. So I'm going to call him Janibek. Even the commentators on ESPN tend to call him Janibek rather than use his surname. Anyway, he won the WBO interim middleweight world title in his last fight against Danny Dignam of the UK. That was a second round knockout. Real good uppercut there. And this is the fight here. You can watch the highlight reel KO on the, I think it's the ESPN, Top Rank boxing channel. It's right there. So Janibek is not someone I'm overly familiar with, but if we have a look at his record here, he turned pro in 2016. He had a split decision draw over Vaughn Alexander in his fourth professional fight. I'm not sure whether that was a legit split decision, as in it should have been a split decision, or whether it was one of those weird things where one of the judges was sipping, he had a bottle of whiskey underneath the table and was sipping it while he was watching the fight. I don't know, but he did have a split decision against Vaughn Alexander in his fourth fight back in 2018. He's gone on to fight the likes of, some nondescript opposition in the meantime, but in 2021, Rob Brandt, he had a win over him in 8 rounds. I guess that's a good thing to have on your resume. And then Hassan and Dam and Jickham, the same year, he stopped him in 8 rounds as well before defeating Dignam earlier this year to capture the WBO interim world middleweight title. Now, having watched him, a few videos of him here, he is a southpaw. And if anyone knows anything about Eubank Jr., it is that he has struggled with a couple of southpaws in the past. Obviously, Billy Joe Saunders beat him. And then, several years ago, when he fought Matt Korobov. Now, the Korobov fight only went 2 rounds because Korobov, ended up injuring his shoulder. So the fight had to end there. It was a TKO. He was unable to continue. But Eubank Jr. looked like he was about to get schooled in that fight. I know he was only 2 rounds in, and a lot can happen in a fight after the first 2 rounds. But to me, it looked like it was shaped. Eubank Jr. was getting pinged straight away in that fight. And I know now he's with Roy Jones Jr. and all this kind of stuff. And Roy Jones Jr. has changed him somewhat. But he's always struggled with technical guys, for one, whether they're southpaw or orthodox. I think southpaw, adds an extra layer of difficulty for Eubank Jr. That's my perception of things. So stylistically, I think this is probably a bad fight for Chris Eubank Jr. But as Ben Shalom said, Eubank Jr. is 32 years of age now. So really and truly, it's now or never. He's not going to get that much better from this point on, the work he's doing with Roy Jones and whatever. So he has to step up and fight for world honors. But whether he will against this particular opponent remains to be seen. We know that Eubank Jr. had his sights set on Golovkin, but he's partaking in the trilogy fight with Canelo now, so that's out of the equation. Jamal Charlo is apparently injured. He was supposed to go through with a defense against Selecki. So this is the only road for Eubank Jr. right now, is to go in there and fight this unbeaten southpaw. And like I say, this looks like a difficult assignment for him. Will he be up for it, or will he look for something which suits him more stylistically? Is this the reason why Eubank Jr. was looking for the Conor Benn fight, potentially the Billy Joe Saunders fight, the Kell Brook fight, etc.? Because he didn't fancy getting in there with a guy like Janibek, someone who doesn't really suit him stylistically. I know some people are going to say, well, Billy Joe Saunders is a southpaw too, beat Eubank Jr. before. Yeah, but Billy Joe Saunders has seen better days. Is Billy Joe Saunders at this stage even as good as Janibek? I don't know, but he's certainly younger and fresher, and he appears to be taller. I know Billy Joe Saunders may be listed as a similar height to this 5'11", but I don't think he is in reality. I think Janibek is actually the taller man. So, as I say, let me know what you guys think about this potential matchup between Eubank Jr. and Janibek. Is this something you think Eubank Jr. would actually take? Obviously, he did fight Korobov, but that's when Eubank Jr. was with PBC. How much choice did he have at the time, you know? And perhaps the Korobov fight, the way the first 2 rounds went, might have put more doubt in Eubank Jr.'s mind over facing southpaws. Perhaps not, you know, it's all speculative at the end of the day, but I do wonder how much he fancies getting in there with a guy like this, a technical guy. It's not like the guy's going to go in there and smash him to pieces. It's the fear of being outboxed, perhaps, you know? Whereas with Billy Joe Saunders, he's familiar with him. He's been in there with him before, and he had a lot of success in the second half against Billy Joe Saunders, who does tend to tire in the second half of fights. And, you know, it's interesting that Ben Shalom is trying to speak on behalf of Eubank Jr. at this stage because, you know, Ben Shalom isn't his promoter, but he obviously has some level of influence over the fights that Sky pursue. You understand what I'm saying? So maybe there's perhaps a conflict of interest. Again, it's all speculation, a conflict of interest where maybe Eubank Jr. wants to pursue certain fights, but Sky and Ben Shalom maybe want him to pursue different fights because they have a different agenda. They want big fights on their platform. Their best interests aren't necessarily the same as Eubank Jr.'s best interests all of the time. There may be situations where it's better for Eubank Jr. to take one opponent, but for Sky and Boxer, it's better for him to do something a bit different. And why I say Boxer is because, as far as I'm aware, they have some involvement in the promotion of Eubank Jr.'s fights. It isn't just the Sauerland thing. I think Boxer have some type of involvement there. Maybe I'm wrong. It's a fledgling promotional company, at least in terms of their relationship with Sky. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments below about all the points I've raised in this video. Are you familiar with Janibek? And how do you think Eubank Jr. would fare against him if the fight were to take place? Let me know, people. And of course, if Demetrius Andrade abandons his campaign, 168 pounds, and Andrade moves back down to 160 pounds, that's another slick southpaw for Eubank Jr. to try and contend with. You know, he hasn't seemed that keen about facing Demetrius Andrade from what I can remember. So make it out what you will.